moving on to talk about Israel and this story that I outlined on the show a couple weeks ago when it was first coming out, and that was the rampant abuse of the Pegasus program by the that's created by the Israeli NSO Group. And so this NSO Group in Israel, by the way, is made up of former Israeli government intelligence and military officials. I think it's the 488 group. I'm not certain of that though. But there's a former unit in Israel that's mainly made up, and the veterans from that group are this NSO group that developed this spyware Pegasus that was used on dissidents of all over the world, politicians, world leaders. Jamal Khashoggi, famously assassinated by the Saudis. This was on his phone, and the U.S. actually a week ago sanctioned the NSO group because of the abuses of this spyware. Now, a really important thing to note is that this is an essentially Israeli government company, as they do license this product to anybody they give it to. And so, this is Lockheed Martin, but maybe a little bit more actually connected to the Israeli government, just to understand. Now, we had this come out, and then we also had Israel in October label 6 Palestinian rights groups as terrorist organizations. And so I'm going to get into all that right here with first this article from Phil Weiss, published at Mondo Weiss. Israel's secret evidence against rights groups is based on torture and lies. Europeans rejected it. Palestinian leaders tell Odysee audience. And so the 6 groups here, just to go back and review, are Defense for Children International Palestine, Union for Agricultural Council, Al Haq, Bison Center for Research and Development, Adamir, and Union of Palestinian Women, and I think committee. And so these are the names of all these groups. And in here, the groups say that what they think that they were targeted over and why they were labeled terrorist groups is because they have been working with the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and bringing examples of Israeli war crimes committed to the Palestinians and evidence of those war crimes to the ICC. And so the Israeli government also was trying to get these groups defunded for the past couple of months. And they actually went to European countries, which are the main backers and funders of the groups, and presented them with the same kind of secret dossier of evidence that they gave to the US. And the European governments, including Belgian officials, investigated it and rejected the allegations presented in the dossier as propaganda and lies. And for that reason, European governments didn't take any action or, any kind of demands or interest in these groups and, attempting to defund them because, they saw this is not, being nothing wrong. Another reason Israel targeted is that some of these groups also provided evidence of Israeli war crimes to U.S. representative, probably the best person, at least in the House, on Palestine, Betty McCollum of Minnesota. And wanted to cut off aid to Israel that they used to arrest children. So, this is what Phil Weiss is putting forward, and he does an excellent job of outlining some of the testimony brought and the importance of what these groups were doing. He also highlights that some of these 6 groups do employ Americans, and so when Israel labels them as a terrorist organization and wants the U.S. to take some kind of action, that may or may not mean taking action against U.S. citizens. And so this is something that has a chance to get more mainstream media attention in the US and has so far. That's one of the reasons that I think this story is so important to highlight. Then in here, Phil Weiss says one of the attorneys for one of the men whose testimony was used in the dossier against these groups claims that that the evidence was obtained under torture. Now, she says that she cannot currently present this evidence. The attorney can, because the case is ongoing. That made sense. But just wanted to highlight that they do say that some of this evidence was actually obtained through Israel using torture on Palestinians. Al-Haq, one of the groups here, says that Israel has for a while been attempting to target its funders with the information used in this dossier, so they're aware of some of the information and they know that it's all propaganda. And then I think, the last thing that Phil Weitz points out in this article that's very important is he says that, the justification that the Israeli government used here was absolutely so vague that it really could be applied to anyone in Palestine, including like the Palestinian president, Mohammed Abbas. And so this is another real problem that the Israeli terrorist organization label has on these six groups, is that it's a very vague law and they use bunk information. Now, the reason that the label came when it did, I believe, may be because these members of these SIDS organizations actually reached out to frontline defenders 3 days before the label came, saying that they were concerned that their devices had been hacked and implanted with the Pegasus software. And so they gave their devices to frontline defenders who did some analysis. And then this analysis was confirmed by Amnesty International and Citizens Lab. So this is pretty conclusive that members of these six groups all had the Israeli NSO Group software Pegasus on their phones, which in this article by Kevin Gostola lays out, how important that this is, because it's not only that this software would allow them to go through anybody's emails and text messages and calls and voicemails and see everything that they were doing on the phone. But let's say that you're in a room with a group of people and they decide that they want to know what's being said. They could activate microphones and video and all this other stuff. And so it really turns your phone into a weapon against you. And this was, again, human rights groups that Israel is targeting, with this. Long before these groups were hit with the terrorist designation label, the software in the phone goes back to at least July of 2020 in the member of the Al-Haq group whose device was hacked. I'm not sure for every single one of them. And so, this says that Israel was doing this for a long time just to international groups. And it was likely because these groups were talking with the ICC. And so Israel likely has all the communications and all the, claims made between these groups and the ICC. Let's see. I guess the next thing I want to get into is to point out that it seems to me that if one of the companies was using this, or one of the countries, so let's say Israel actually exported and licensed this technology to the UAE, who then spied on these groups. It seems very likely, from my understanding of the Pegasus technology and how the NSO Group works with the Israeli government, that the Israeli government would have that information. And so, there's a couple possibilities here where, the Israeli government was either just happy to get it, or maybe they had a quid pro quo with another country like the UAE or, Poland or whoever the hell, where they were going to be the ones that targeted these Palestinian groups, and that the Israeli government was just going to benefit from mining the technology, the data from that, and is kind of, they kind of have a level of deniability or something like that, that comes from running that scam this way. Now, as I mentioned, the NSO Group, along with one other Israeli company, was actually sanctioned by the U.S., a pretty rare move. And while, again, I'm always opposed to sanctions, let's say, you have President Kyle Anzalone and he's, sitting at his desk signing all the orders to get rid of all of the sanctions. Certainly at the very bottom of all the piles is going to be the order to get rid of the sanctions on the NSO Group. But the NSO Group has gone on a pretty majoring lobbying campaign to try to get this undone. They've employed former Obama Department of Homeland Security Secretary Jed Johnson. They've also employed a couple different legal firms to lobby for them, including a legal firm that employs and is a big shot there is Rod Rosenstein, who was, of course, a part of the Trump Department of Justice, and Tom Ridge, who was Bush's, I think, very first Department of Homeland Security head. And so they're working very, very hard on a lobbying effort in the United States. Now, there is a secondary goal that they have, and they're actually currently being sued by WhatsApp, but this goes back to 2019. So it's a little bit of a different case, but I'm sure the lobbying of the U.S. is all the same. Now, it's not just the NSO Group and their lobbyists, but also the Israeli government that is actually pushing back on these sanctions. And it's the Israeli government saying things like, look, we license these products. We know where these products are going. And so if you're criticizing what the NSO software, what the Pegasus program is being used for, then you're also criticizing the Israeli state. Now, the response to this should be absolutely correct, and that's why we're cutting all the funding that we give to Israel tomorrow. But unfortunately, that argument is kind of weaponized in the other direction to say, oh yeah, we do support what Israel's doing, so I guess we support this. Now Israel says, oh, we're gonna have some new procedures and stuff like this, all these basically meaningless words to try to get the US to lift the sanctions on this company. My guess is that it will happen, even if it takes a couple months. Eventually the US will lift these sanctions. Now, another spying program going on in Israel is a little bit different than the one by Pegasus. This is outlined in the Washington Post, and actually we have a great write-up on it at antiwar.com today from Brett Wilkins, titled Organized State Terrorism, Palestinians Condemn New Israeli Surveillance Revelations. And this is getting into the Blue Wolf program that the Israelis set up. According to the Washington Post, the surveillance initiative rolled out over the past 2 years involves in part a smartphone technology called Blue Wolf that captures photos of Palestinians' faces and matches them to a database of images so extensive that one former soldier described it as the Army's secret Facebook for Palestinians. And so essentially they have facial recognition for all the Palestinians, photos of all of them, profile set up of all of them, probably, what they do, where they went to school, where they live, who their relatives are, how many degrees of separations the Israelis could claim between them and their cousins, husbands, brother who is a member of Hamas or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad or something like that, which they will use to then, say that this person is dangerous when they want to detain them. The post goes on, the phone app flashes in a different color to set alert soldiers if a person is determined is to be, detained, arrested, or left alone. And so imagine this, right? You have like yellow, orange, red, orange, and green. And, every time a Palestinian walks by an Israeli soldier, they have a little camera on them, and it scans their face. It looks through their Palestinian secret Facebook profile and determines if they're green, orange, or red. And if, red flashes, you're arrested, probably possibly killed by the Israeli soldier during that arrest. beaten. Whoever is with you is also abused by the Israeli soldiers. You're hauled off to jail, and that is the sole reason for it. That's the kind of apartheid system that the Israeli government has now set up for the Palestinians, and it's absolutely horrific. In this article by Brett Wilkins, he has this quote from, I think it's a Palestinian woman, talking about how essentially they just don't socialize anymore because there's phones everywhere, and if you go outside, you're being filmed, and you're potentially going to walk past the camera, it's going to flash red, and they're going to get you. The whistleblowers here are part of the what was the group called? It is sorry, I forget part of the group, but they were incentivizing the soldiers to take pictures, saying whoever collects the most pictures this particular week gets a certain bonus. And, this is all a really important story to talk about here, and just the level of abuse that's currently being faced by the Palestinians. But if you want another reason to care about it, think about this technology maybe being used in the United States by cops, where every time you walk by a cop, you get green if they know you're vaccinated, yellow if you might be vaccinated and they're going to ask you for your papers, and red if they know you're unvaccinated and they're going to haul you off. That's the kind of oppression that the Palestinians currently live under. Oh, and then the Palestinian group is breaking not the Palestinian group, the Israeli group of former IDF members who are, talking about the abuses they commit as part of the IDF is called breaking the silence. So talking about the oppression that the Palestinians face, I want to talk about two particular stories of 15-year-old boys who were killed by Palestinian forces. Most recently is Muhammad Amjad Dadas, who was in the village of Deir al-Tabab, which is near the West Bank city of Nablus, where Israeli forces were attacking Palestinian youth with canisters and stun grenades. Mohammed and some other boys he was with walked to see what was going on. When they were about 50 meters from the protest, he was shot in the abdomen by an Israeli sniper and later died. And again, this is just like a 15-year-old boy who was in no way per se a threat to anybody. One of the really important things about this story to think about is it was reported by Defense of Children International Palestine, and so that this is one of the groups that Israel has labeled a terrorist organization. This is a group that actually is reporting on terrorism, not a terrorist organization. The other story is actually from, I think, early August, when you had Ahmed Khalid Hashasha, who was killed in the Balta refugee camp, again near Nablus, by security forces. And so the security forces carried out a raid in the refugee camp. And I guess as the raid and the happenings were going on, Ahmed and his brother, who is 19-year-old, Ahmed's 15, go up to the roof of their home, and they're sitting there recording the Palestinian police. They also have a relative that's on a adjacent home who's also sitting there watching. So see, this is a common thing. Palestinians sit on the roofs of their homes, see what's going on. Something I could certainly imagine myself doing as a 15-year-old. As the soldiers were leaving, Ahmed was trying to record what the soldiers, just I guess them walking around, whatever. Maybe he's gonna make a video and be like, haha, look at the colonizers being walking out of the village empty-handed or something like that. Maybe they have something, he's trying to record evidence of it, whatever. He's just a kid on his home recording. The IDF says that they saw him there holding something and they thought he was going to throw it, so they shot and killed him. Now, his brother and his relative and the Israeli human rights group, B'Talem, say that this is not the case. And, he was just standing there holding holding his phone recording, and the Israeli occupation forces shot him for that reason. No chance that he's going to, have any justice, that his killer will be held responsible. These are two murders of children. And there's not even the pretense or the thought or the idea that the people who shot and killed them will even remotely be held responsible. And in fact, most of the reporting and the way this is going to be, described in the international press is that if it wasn't for the Palestinian terrorists, that, these killings would have never happened. It's just all the problem of the Palestinians, and is no way the fault of Israel whatsoever. And if you want to say, point out these crimes and say we should really cut military aid to Israel, they'll say, well, you just don't want Israel to exist, and you want the terrorists to win. All right, Israel has been waging a pretty extensive war against one of its neighboring states, Syria, for essentially the past decade. That's gotten absolutely no coverage whatsoever. Hundreds, and now it may even be like into the thousands of airstrikes that Israel has carried out. And right at the end of October, they carried out an airstrike in Metro Damascus, killing 5 members of Syrian militia and wounding 2 Syrian soldiers. And then there were other airstrikes in the outskirts of Damascus at the beginning of November. Wasn't clear if or how many people were killed, but again, these are in the outskirts and within the city of Syria's capital that is regularly carrying out bombing. This is absolutely traumatizing for the people that live there, to have to live under a constant bombing campaign. Several times a week, Israel is carrying out bombs. Recently, I think this is November 7th, they targeted the city of Homs and Tartarus, Syria, with missiles. Now, Syria says they intercept them as always, but this is also dangerous. A lot of heavy missiles going off, exploding in the air, and people live here. People are dying from these actions. And of course, there's no care by Israel or the United States. In fact, if the United States is going to say one country is a threat, they actually say it's Syria, not Israel. Israel's IDF also says that it's accelerating plans to attack Iran. I'm not sure if this actually means anything. Israel recently approved $1.5 additional billion to its military budget aimed at attacking Iran. This may just be rhetoric, is kind of my thought that Israeli officials are putting out, looking to, deter any diplomacy between the U.S. and Iran, because Israel threatens Iran and the U.S. is trying to engage in diplomacy with Iran, but as Israel is threatening Iran, the U.S. is engaging in military exercises with Israel. And so obviously Iran kind of realizes that the U.S. offer of diplomacy is really a fake offer, and is far more interested in engaging in military activity with Israel. We also have Israel attempting to block the U.S. from opening an office, like a diplomatic office for Palestinians, essentially an embassy for Palestinians in the West Bank, or excuse me, not in the West Bank, in Jerusalem. The U.S. always had an office for Palestinians in Jerusalem. When Trump moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which of course was a signal that the one-state solution is dead, essentially saying that this is recognized as an Israeli city, the capital of Israel, and the Palestinians are essentially going to be pushed off of all their former land. The U.S. actually closed the diplomatic office it had there, where it serviced, Israel's Arab citizens and, Palestinians who lived in the West Bank and wherever. The Biden administration has been attempting to reopen that office. However, it continues to be denied so by Israel. And now Israel is telling the Biden administration to open that office in the West Bank. And it's just absolutely unbelievable that you are the world superpower, the president of the world empire, Joe Biden, and you give a country, a wealthy country that has plenty of services for its citizens, a very developed military with F-35s and all kinds of other technology that essentially dominates all of its rivals, has nuclear weapons, and you give them $4+ billion a year in military aid, and then that country is going to tell you where you are going to open offices? That it's absolutely unbelievable that the Biden administration will allow itself to be disgraced in this way. All right. Also, want to mention that Marianne Adelson, who the wife of the late Sheldon Adelson, is probably now the wealthiest Republican donor on the planet. And just in course, in case anybody was wondering, she is expected to be just as big of a player in support of Israel as her husband. Recently, she hosted the conference that featured Nikki Haley, criticizing members of the Israel lobby J Street for not being hawkish enough on Iran. You know, one of the main Iran hots in the U.S. is the Israel lobby, and Nikki Haley is mad that they're in any way kind of saying that, oh, maybe the Iran nuclear deal is better than pushing Iran and getting in a war with the country. And so it just, I think, goes to show that we're going to see a lot of the same from the top Republican donors, even as some of the older, rich people like Sheldon Adelson, are, I guess, unfortunately no longer with us. Let's see. Want to talk about briefly here Politico's new owner and the line that his staff are going to have to toe. And so let me make sure I get this company's name right. It's a German media company named Axel Springer. Now, Axel Springer was a guy. I think, he died maybe in the 80s, and he was the head of the company. But now, so some people are saying it as like the man Axel Springer bought Politico. No, it's the company Axel Springer that bought Politico. However, the company still maintains the values of its original owner. And in Germany, it requires its staff to sign a pledge that has, several things like Israel has a right to exist, the transatlantic alliance is important, and pro-European Union, maybe union not capitalized there. And so, while it doesn't appear that Politico, under the ownership of Axel Springer, will require its writers to actually physically sign the pledge, it is going to hold the writers to these standards. So, very much expect the reporting from Politico to get even worse and even more pro-empire. However, one thing to point out, people are saying this like, oh, it's a wild thing. We should remember that Emily Wilder was a 22-year-old working for AP who, I forget what she was actually reporting on, but it had nothing to do with Israel, Palestine, international affairs, or anything like that. But she was actually fired for past pro-Palestinian tweets that she had put out on her Twitter account during college. And so this is absolutely the standard of American media. And if anybody, really wants to wonder why we have the reporting we do, it's because anybody who dissents gets fired. And, it doesn't matter what department that you're in, whether it's sports or anything else. If you do not believe in the international establishment consensus, the world empire, you will not be allowed to work and do journalism in any form for major American media outlets. That's just the case. Now,